It begins with light, the kind of light that belongs to morning, a soft, forgiving brightness spilling across a small kitchen table. She is there, her hands moving in a quiet rhythm, making breakfast, answering questions from her young son in the distracted, automatic way that parents sometimes do when their mind is already elsewhere. The scene is ordinary to the point of invisibility, and yet something in the air feels taut. It's not what's happening, but the way she moves, a flicker of urgency beneath the stillness, as if she is preparing for something but not saying it out loud. This small domestic island dissolves quickly. Soon she's loading the boy into her car, the day stretching ahead in that ambiguous way weekends do, no firm edges, no pressing schedule. She arrives at the marina, the air open and restless, the kind of place where the smell of salt and oil lives in the wind. Her friends are waiting, a mix of personalities, laughter, and subtle dynamics you can read even before they speak. There's Greg, steady and calm, the one who seems to be holding the whole group together. There's Victor, younger and a little restless, who watches the others with a curiosity that feels both playful and slightly detached. Sally is warm but sharp-eyed, her partner Downey a quieter presence beside her, steady but cautious. Heather, another friend, rounds out the group with a lightness that feels necessary, as though she's the one who keeps the atmosphere buoyant. They're here to sail and the day seems made for it. There's a brightness to the sky, a glimmer on the water that suggests calm. They set out with that buoyant energy, the gentle slap of water against the hull matching the easy rhythm of their conversation. She's quieter than the rest, smiling when spoken to, but glancing often toward the shore as if leaving it behind is both a relief and a worry. Greg seems particularly attuned to her, asking if she's all right, and she offers him one of those soft assurances that means nothing and everything. I'm fine. Time moves differently on the water. Minutes stretch, conversations fold into pauses, and the horizon holds still no matter how far they go. It is during one of those stretches, a lull between laughter, that something shifts. The wind drops first as though it has been suddenly cut off. Then the air thickens and the light changes. A shadow crawls across the sea, moving fast. It's not a cloud in the usual sense, not the slow procession of weather anyone could anticipate. This comes like a wall of force. The sails whip in protest, the waves grow teeth, and in moments the calm ocean turns hostile. It's chaos, shouting, grabbing for rails, securing what they can. Heather disappears in the confusion, swept into the churning water before anyone realizes she's gone. The storm takes the rest of them too, but not in the same way. It throws them, scatters them, leaves them clinging to the capsized boat, their breaths raw from salt water and fear. The sky is a slab of gray above them, the sea a restless machine beneath, and then, through the haze of spray, it appears. Enormous, impossible, gliding through the water with an unnatural stillness for something so massive, an ocean liner, silent. It doesn't answer their calls or signals, but it's moving toward them, steady as a predator, until it draws close enough that they can see the details of its hull, the weathered streaks along its white sides, the name painted in faded letters. The gangway is down. Climbing aboard is like stepping out of one world into another. The storm still rages below, but here on the deck the air is calmer, the sea merely an echo in the distance. The space is deserted, or it should be. The deck stretches wide and clean, the sound of their footsteps ringing louder than they should. It's the kind of silence that feels curated, the kind you find in a room someone has just left. They move in together at first, scanning the length of the ship for any sign of life. It's vast and unfamiliar, but she seems different. Her eyes dart to certain corners, certain corridors, with something that looks almost like recognition. She doesn't say it, but the way she moves, hesitating at some turns, walking decisively down others, makes it seem as though she's been here before. Inside, the corridors are long and dim, lined with ornate fixtures that feel decades old. The group calls out, their voices carrying strangely. Somewhere far off, a door creaks. There's food laid out in the dining area, still warm, still fresh, as if passengers had been sitting here only moments ago, but no one answers. Chairs are pushed back, plates half-eaten. The absence is unnerving not just because it's empty, but because it's recently empty. She starts to notice things before the others do. A set of keys dropped on the floor, a smudge of something dark on the wall, a faint sound from a distant corridor that makes her freeze mid-step. When Victor asks her what's wrong, she shakes her head, unwilling to explain, or perhaps unable to put it into words. The ship seems endless. Hallways fold into staircases, staircases into more hallways. Every turn feels both random and inevitable. And then there's that moment, small, almost ignorable, when they pass a mirror and she pauses, her reflection catching her eye in a way that feels wrong. She doesn't linger, but her steps afterward are sharper, more cautious. When they hear the first sound of another person, relief blooms in the group, but it's not a normal sound, not footsteps approaching, but the heavy thud of something dropped, followed by a scraping noise, metal on metal. Greg calls out, his voice carrying into the vastness. Silence answers. And then, just as they're about to turn a corner, something flashes, movement, a figure darting out of sight, wearing a mask that hides every trace of a face. From here, the unease becomes something more tangible. The ship is no longer merely empty, it's alive in the wrong way. They're being watched. The masked figure moves with purpose, with the advantage of knowing the space, while they are always half a step too slow, turning corners a moment too late. At first it feels like a game of avoidance, but then it escalates. The figure is armed, and the rules shift from evasion to survival. In the chaos, the group begins to splinter. Victor, separated from the others, finds something on the deck that makes his breath catch, an object that shouldn't be here, something he recognizes as belonging to one of their own, but aged and worn as though it had been here for years. When he brings it back to the others, the explanations falter. The logical part of their minds tries to file it under coincidence, but the air is thick with the unspoken. They've stepped into something that doesn't obey the rules they know. It's around this time that she begins to act differently, not panicked like the others, but calculating, as if she's playing out scenarios in her head before they happen. There are moments when she urges them to take a certain path or avoid a certain room, and when they don't listen, the outcome always proves her right. But her foresight doesn't come with comfort. It seems to weigh on her, each correct prediction etched into her face like a fresh wound. The violence, when it comes, is swift and disorienting. The masked figure is no longer a shadow on the edge of their vision. It's here, hunting with precision. They fight back, but the narrow corridors and strange acoustics make it hard to tell where danger is coming from. Shots echo, shouts overlap, and the ship seems to warp around them, every passage leading them deeper instead of out. By the time they reach the upper deck again, they're fewer than before. And there's something almost unbearable in the air now, not just fear, but the sense that this has happened before, that they're stepping into a rhythm already set, playing roles they didn't choose in a script they didn't write. She knows it, you can see it in her eyes, in the way she watches the masked figure as if she's trying to remember something important, something she's already forgotten and learned again 100 times over. And then comes the sight that freezes her in place, a small, scattered collection of objects on the deck, each one identical to something they've seen or thought they'd seen earlier, not one or two duplicates, but dozens. The implication is too large to hold in her mind, too impossible to accept fully, but she doesn't need to say it. The truth is already in the air between them, heavy as the sea pressing against the hull. Would you like me to continue with the second half in the same style, so it flows seamlessly into the unraveling of the twists and resolution? It begins in the kind of morning light that doesn't announce itself loudly, soft, filtered, almost fragile as it passes through curtains and settles on a modest kitchen table. She's there, moving with the habitual rhythm of someone who has repeated these motions 1,000 times before, pouring juice, buttering toast, checking the clock as though the day already has her on a leash. Her young son sits across from her, his presence grounding but also tugging at her with unspoken weight. It's a scene that should feel ordinary, but there's something in the way her eyes keep sliding elsewhere, as though her thoughts live in another room entirely. She moves quickly, gathering what she needs, speaking to him in a voice that tries to be steady. There's love there, no question, but also the sense of someone bracing against a current she can't see but knows is coming. Soon she's ushering him into the car, the sound of the engine breaking the quiet as the world outside grows larger and less forgiving. The air is heavy with salt and sun when she arrives at the marina, a place alive with the smell of oil, damp wood, and distant laughter from other boats preparing to leave shore. Her friends are already there. Greg greets her first, calm, solid, the kind of man who seems to instinctively take responsibility for the group's well-being. Beside him is Victor, younger and a touch restless, his curiosity evident in the way he watches everything as though testing its weight. Sally stands close to her partner, Downey, whose quiet presence feels protective but also cautious, like someone always ready for things to go wrong. Heather arrives last, light-footed and quick to smile, her laughter the kind that momentarily chases away shadows. The plan is simple, a day on the water. The weather, at first glance, seems to promise just that. The sky is wide and open, the waves gentle enough to make their departure feel effortless. They set out together, the boat cutting smoothly through the blue, the sails filling with wind as conversation drifts between them. She's quieter than the others, responding when spoken to, but glancing often toward the horizon, as though leaving land behind is both a relief and a quiet ache. Greg notices, asks if she's all right. She gives him the kind of smile that says everything and nothing at once. I'm fine. Time stretches at sea. Minutes lose their edges, folding into each other in a slow, easy rhythm. It's in one of these lulls, when voices fade and only the creak of the boat and the slap of water remain, that the change comes. The first hint is subtle, a shift in the wind, a sudden stillness in the air. Then the light shifts, draining of its warmth as if some unseen hand has dimmed it. Shadows crawl over the waves, growing faster than any storm cloud should. What follows is chaos. The wind slams into the sails with brutal force, the sea heaving and twisting beneath them. Shouts cut through the roar of water, hands grabbing for railings, trying to secure what can't be secured. In the sudden violence of it, Heather is swept overboard, her scream lost almost instantly to the storm's rage. The others barely have time to react before the waves are tossing them too, forcing them to cling desperately to the capsized hull. Saltwater stings their eyes and lungs, the storm wrapping them in a disorienting, relentless fury. And then through the spray and blur, something massive emerges. It's not the rolling wall of a wave, but the sharp, deliberate outline of an ocean liner, its hull towering above them. It moves with an eerie steadiness, untouched by the chaos around it. They shout, wave their arms, desperate for rescue, but there is no response from its decks. The gangway is lowered as if in invitation. Climbing aboard is a surreal shift, like stepping out of one reality into another. The storm still howls below, but here on the deck, the air is almost unnaturally calm. The space is vast and silent, the only sound their own footsteps against the metal. There's no one in sight, no movement except for the slow drift of the ship through the water. They move cautiously, sticking together at first, their voices echoing strangely in the emptiness. The size of the deck makes them feel small, the absence of crew or passengers unsettling in a way none of them can quite name. Inside, the corridors stretch long and narrow, lined with fixtures that speak of another time, polished brass, faded carpeting, the faint scent of something old and metallic. It's the dining area that stops them. The tables are set, the food laid out, still fresh, as though a meal had been interrupted moments before. Plates half-eaten, glasses half-full, chairs pushed back in a way that suggests sudden departure. It's too precise to be coincidence, too recent to make sense. She notices details the others miss, a smudge of something dark on the wall, a set of keys lying just out of place, the faint sound of movement from somewhere deeper in the ship. When Victor asks if she heard something, she only shakes her head, but her eyes betray her. She knows, or at least feels, that they're not alone. As they press on, the ship begins to feel less like a rescue and more like a labyrinth. Hallways loop back on themselves, staircases lead to familiar places when they should lead somewhere new. In a wide, dim corridor, they pass a mirror and she pauses, not because of vanity, but because something about the reflection feels wrong, slightly off in a way she can't explain. She keeps moving, but the hesitation lingers. The first sighting of another person comes suddenly, a flicker of movement at the end of a hall. Relief spikes in their voices as Greg calls out, but the figure doesn't respond. It moves quickly, slipping out of sight, and when it reappears it's masked, the face entirely concealed by something smooth and expressionless. The mask turns toward them, and for a moment no one breathes. From then on, the air changes. The ship is no longer merely empty, it's aware. They are being watched, followed, herded through its corridors. The masked figure moves with purpose, always one step ahead, always choosing the angles where it can appear suddenly, vanish just as quickly. What begins as avoidance becomes pursuit. The figure is armed, and soon it's clear this isn't random. There's intent here, precision. In the scramble to avoid confrontation, the group becomes separated. Victor stumbles into a section of the deck littered with strange, out-of-place items, a weathered photograph, a watch, a blood-stained scrap of fabric. Some of it he recognizes, impossibly, as belonging to them. The realization shakes him, the logic of it refusing to hold still in his mind. When he returns to the others, there's no way to explain it that doesn't sound insane. She is changing, though. While the others react with fear, she moves with an odd kind of certainty, steering them away from some hallways, toward others, making decisions that suggest she knows what's about to happen. But it's not the confidence of someone in control, it's the burden of someone who's seen this before and knows how it ends. The first violent clash is brief and brutal. The masked figure strikes with calculated force, the corridors amplifying every sound, making it impossible to tell where the next blow might come from. They fight back, but the ship seems to twist around them, leading them deeper, stripping away their sense of direction. By the time they reach the open deck again, their numbers are smaller, and then she sees it, a small pile of objects in the exact same arrangement as the ones Victor found earlier. Not one set, many. Each identical, each impossibly aged or fresh depending on where they sit in the pile. The sight holds her in place, her breath catching as the implication crashes over her. She doesn't say the words, but it's already there, pressing in on all of them. This isn't the first time. This has happened before, and whatever brought them here is not finished with them yet. If you want, I can now move into the second half of the plot in the exact same tone, so the unraveling of twists and resolution flow seamlessly. The deck becomes a ledger. Every duplicate trinket, every scuffed key, every note scrawled in a hand that is and isn't hers tallies a debt she doesn't yet know how to settle. She doesn't say it out loud. She doesn't have to. The others feel it too, the way air goes thin before a storm. They are standing in the middle of something that's already happened, like walking out onto a stage where the lines have been said and will be said again. The sea heaves softly against the hull, indifferent, as if to remind them that cycles are nature's native tongue. The practical thing would be to turn back, but there's nowhere to go. The ship's corridors swallow intention and return only momentum. When they move as a group, the angles refuse them. When they split, the labyrinth seems to welcome them, offering short, direct routes to dread. She is the one who understands first that moving isn't the same as progressing. She doesn't name it fate. She doesn't name it at all. She just takes the lead because someone must. Victor wanders. It's not rebellion so much as curiosity, the kind the young can't help but obey. He finds his way to a service stairwell that smells like damp steel and old oil, the kind of place where sound travels too far and light dies early. There's a smear on the wall at the landing, brown, then red when his eyes adjust, and a twist of rope discarded as if someone cut a knot in anger. He calls her name, a tentative sound, almost embarrassed. When she appears, it's with an urgency that reads as foresight rather than surprise. "Don't touch anything," she says without explaining why. It should be an odd instruction. Instead, it feels like a memory. A sound above, then behind, then nowhere. The masked figure is motion, not presence. The first time it lunges, the strike is clumsy, closer to a test than a kill, and Victor stumbles back into her. She moves with the sort of quickness that is not learned in an afternoon. It belongs to long practice. She pulls him down, the blow glancing into metal where moments before his head had been. There isn't time to marvel at survival. The figure withdraws and she makes the call. Split again, but on her terms this time. She will draw the hunter. The others will find a radio, a flare, anything that speaks of the outside world. The theater, the ship has won, impossibly ornate, curtain-heavy as a winter night, becomes the next arena. She swears she can hear the echo of applause that isn't there, and the thought carries a bitter aftertaste. This was built for people who wanted to be seen. Now it keeps secrets. Sally and Downey try the doors, each handle cold like a refusal. She's at the stage edge, peering into the orchestra pit, when the masked figure appears in a balcony, as if conjured by the architecture itself. The first shot takes a chunk out of the red velvet, the second finds metal. There's no time to argue about plans. She yanks the two of them toward a service corridor, and the ship seems to lane, guiding them with the inevitability of a funnel. Somewhere else, Greg is doing the noble thing, trying to repair the world with a wrench and a radio. The control room has the stale breath of long abandonment, and the dials offer only the pretense of agency. He spins knobs, begs the air to reply, says their names like charms. When she finds him, he doesn't ask how she knew where he'd be. He just says, "Tell me what to do," and there's a trust in it, a surrender to competence that pierces her like a kindness she hasn't earned. They set a trap, not clever, not original, merely human. A corridor that dead ends, a reflective panel, a noise designed to lure. She takes the bait herself, stepping into the kill box because some part of her has already accepted that every path back to shore will pass through violence. When the figure rounds the corner, it's not with the reckless momentum of the chase, but with a soldier's discipline. She braces, strikes, and the world narrows to the heavy thud of bodies against rail and wall. The mask skitters across tile, not off but askew, and she sees enough to dizzy her. A sliver of a cheekbone she recognizes, a mouth she's seen speak her own name. The realization arrives as nausea. It isn't that the hunter looks like her, it's that the hunter moves like her, anticipates like her, corrects like her. A reflexive denial thrashes inside her chest, but reality is patient. It doesn't need agreement, it only needs time. Another loop tightens. Sally and Downey locate a phone that works just long enough to prove that Hope is a trickster. The voice on the other end is her voice, faint and distant, saying words she hasn't yet said, begging Sally to run, to trust her. The connection dies like a candle in a draft, leaving behind the smell of burned-out luck. Downey looks at her with the dawning terror of a man who has just understood that time is not linear on this ship. He says, "When were you here?" And the grammar of the question is wrong in a way neither of them can correct. There's a wound and a warning. Victor doesn't die immediately. He gets a scene that feels different from the others, as if the ship is letting him speak for the audience. He accuses her of withholding, of knowing more than she admits, and he's right. He is also Mercy's last representative. When the masked figure appears, she stands between Victor and the blade because some parts of the loop still allow choice. It isn't enough, the cut arrives anyway, a bright, ugly line across a throat that had so much left to say. He stares at her with the unresolvable question that the dead carry. Why? Grief would be correct, but there isn't room. The ship rewards movement and punishes hesitation. She drags him as far as she can, whispering apologies as if they could calcify into protection. The masked figure fades back into the architecture. Greg reappears, bleeding from a scrape that will mean infection later if later exists. He still looks at her like she can solve this. It is almost unbearable to be trusted in a place designed to make trust fatal. Then comes the balcony, the sun a white smear across the horizon, the ocean pretending innocence. She finds a cache of things that shouldn't be possible, a heap of duplicates, each one belonging to her, each one rusted or pristine on a timeline that refuses her chronology. She understands then that the deck is not a ledger, it is an altar. Sacrifice has been made here. Sacrifice will be made again. The hunt tips into a ritual. She stops running from the masked figure and begins running toward the places where she knows it will be. Their next clash is quick and decisive. A misstep, a grab, the kind of close-quarters violence that has no choreography, only ugly efficiency. The mask breaks loose and falls away. She's staring into her own face, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Self meets self. One of them is breathing harder. It doesn't matter which. They fight with the desperation of the same person arguing with herself in the mirror at 3 a.m, except here the mirror bleeds and the room echoes with the ocean's laughter. When she throws the other her overboard, it isn't triumphant. It is administrative. The loop demands certain gestures. Bodies must be cleared. Roles must be assumed. The one who remains puts on the mask because the loop requires a hunter, and she has been promoted by survival. The hood smells like old breath and salt. She tears it off, nauseated, then forces it back on. The ship doesn't applaud, but it allows. That is its hospitality. A shift then, almost imperceptible. The light resets by a fraction. Far below, the sea shows a different face for a second, and then another. She moves through the corridors now with the fluency of a returning traveler. She knows where Sally will run when panic makes her clumsy. She knows where Downey will try to hide his shaking, the alcove with the brass plate that will clang if brushed. She knows where Greg will wait because good men always wait where they can help. It is not power. It is foreknowledge, a kind of prison with better lighting. She tries mercy first. She warns, pleads, sets her weapon down as if the loop might respond to good behavior. It doesn't. The warnings harden into commands, and when commands fail, into tactics. Downey's fear becomes aggression at the wrong second, and she takes a blow that erases a layer of patience. Sally sees her with the mask half off and makes the only conclusion a heart can afford: betrayal. The ship uses this to fracture the group along lines they were already sketched. Trust cracked by exhaustion, love undermined by suspicion, leadership turned brittle by obligation. The killings are not glorious. They're clumsy when she wishes them elegant, efficient when she wishes for time. Sally's death hurts in a private way because it is accidental and inevitable, a combination that feels cosmically cruel. She tries to save her even as she deals the harm. That is perhaps the most human thing she does on the ship. Downey's end is uglier, anger having chosen his posture for him. Greg's steady, faithful Greg requires the worst of her. When he looks at her and understands, when he says her name as if it could still change the ending, something inside her breaks in a way even the loop cannot reset. Bodies are heavy, she learns that many times. She drags, lifts, heaves, and the sound of flesh meeting deck becomes a metronome by which the ship keeps time. She throws them over, one by one, because that is what the role demands. Each splash is a punctuation mark, a sentence ending that promises a new paragraph starting with the same words. When she is done, when the deck is a blank page again, the horizon offers her the image that began all of this. A small sailing boat, battered, carrying a cluster of people who believe they have just escaped a storm. The wave of despair that rolls through her is so large she has to grip the rail to keep from going with it into the sea. The reset is orderly. The ship has learned the etiquette of tragedy. She sees herself again, another iteration, leading the new arrivals with the same gestures, the same words, the same hopes. For a wild, sacrilegious minute, she thinks about interfering at the introduction point, run down the gangway, throw herself into her other self's arms, beg her to leave. But she has already tried versions of this. The loop turns that plea into another step of choreography, another beat in the dance. She doesn't do it. Instead, she retreats, mask in hand, and prepares to be the monster because monsters on this ship are just protagonists who have lost their place in the sentence. It is only when she falls, because anyone can misjudge a railing, because bodies are not machines, that the ocean claims her outright. The water is a cold that isn't temperature. It is erasure, a relief so absolute it feels like forgiveness. She surfaces coughing near a shore too bright, the sky too honest. The ship becomes absence. Sand fills her shoes. A gull watches. She staggers toward the road thinking, impossibly, that she made it out. A taxi waits with the casualness of a dream. The driver is kind in the way ferrymen are kind, professionally, without questions. He calls her miss like a ritual. When he asks where to, she says home, and the syllable is a prayer. The streets are ordinary, exhaust and sunlight in the usual proportions. She can almost believe that the ship was a concussion, a fever. Home is not a sanctuary, it's a mirror. Through the window she sees a version of herself moving with a sharp, clipped efficiency that is nothing like kindness. The boy is there, his small face arranged into the expression children, where when they're learning what love costs. The woman in the kitchen snaps, then shouts, then throws something without looking. The object hits, and the sound it makes is the sound that breaks the world. Watching from the lawn, she is both mother and witness, defense and jury. Whatever story she has told herself about who she is cannot survive this double exposure. She goes inside. The other her, this hard, frantic version, turns in surprise, then anger. They argue in the language of people who know every bruise on each other's history. The boy retreats to the doorway, eyes wide. The violence that follows is brief because it has to be. When it is over, the kitchen tiles are a geography of red islands, and the woman who used to think of herself as a good mother is dragging a body toward the garage. There is a tarp that was waiting for this day. There is a trunk that becomes a tomb. The boy says nothing because he trusts the quiet more than any promise. They drive. The car becomes a confessional. She tells him it will be okay with a conviction she borrows from elsewhere. A gull hits the windshield, smears, disappears beneath tires. She stops, shaken by the bright, small life she has just crushed. She carries the bird to the guardrail and drops it over, and she notices too late that there are many other small white bodies down there, each in the same place, each evidence that this kindness is repetition, not comfort. She returns to the road because the world does not allow stopping. The crash is physics without mercy, a truck she didn't see, a horn she heard too late, metal folds like paper in enormous hands. When everything stops moving, silence arrives not as peace but as aftermath. She crawls out, blood ribboning from her hairline, and looks into the car. The boy is still. The absence of his movement is a falling forever that no loop can catch. People gather. Someone says her name, though they've never met her. The driver from the taxi appears again, as if he took the long way around to meet her. He puts a gentle hand on her shoulder and speaks in a voice that accepts grief as weather. There's a proposition in his tone that isn't an offer. "Can I take you somewhere?" he asks, and she nods because to refuse is to invent a future she cannot inhabit. In the cab, the radio murmurs the right song at the wrong time. She stares at her hands and thinks of the ship's deck as if it were kinder than this afternoon. The driver does not ask for directions. He is exactly the sort of man you meet once on every shore. The marina is where he delivers her. The sun is wrong again in a way that means correct for cycles. People laugh at nothing. Rope creaks. Boats bob. She sees Greg in the distance, worry already knitted between his brows, and she feels the awful affection that belonging can cause. She knows what will happen when she says hello. She says it anyway. The boy is gone. The trunk is full. The house is a silence. The ship is a horizon. Everything that follows is two things at once, new and remembered. She boards because she boarded. She warns because she warned. She kills because she killed. The specifics are shuffled, the edges sanded differently, but the melody holds. What changes isn't the order of events so much as the clarity with which she recognizes them. She tries experiments, refuses a hallway she once took, chooses a different stair, leaves a message in a place she hadn't. The results are cruelly consistent. Even improvisation becomes part of the score once the ship hears it. And yet there are small rebellions that feel like victories, even if they are. She holds Sally's hand longer this time before the running begins. She apologizes to Victor before he has cause to hate her. She looks at Greg like a woman who knows she is allowed to love someone without deserving him. The ship takes all of this and says, very softly again, what passes for a climax isn't noise, it's comprehension. She sees at last the loop's logic stripped of metaphor. The storm as gate, the liner as stage, the mask as job description, the shore as intermission, the cab as a courtesy, and the home as the true horror she has painted over with explanations. She understands that there is only one thing she hasn't tried, refusal, not of the ship but of herself. Refusal looks like acceptance. She puts on the mask without shaking. She walks the corridors without bargaining. She becomes the antagonist with a steadiness that is not surrender but clarity. Every choice is a straight line now. She kills quickly to minimize suffering. She clears the deck with gentleness. She times her step to the rhythm of the ocean so she won't stumble as the other her comes aboard. When she faces her double again, there is no screaming. There is only the clean violence that avoids cruelty. She drops the body with care because that is a thing she can own in a place that owns nearly everything else. The resolution is not an escape, it is a shape. The storm opens, the boat arrives, the ship receives. She swims or falls or both, and the shore accepts. The cab is waiting, the driver knows. The house is exactly as it must be for her to be asked the question she keeps failing. She kills the worst version of herself because she cannot yet love her. The road offers its inevitable accident. The boy refuses to wake because the world is honest about some things. The marina is constant. If this sounds like despair, it isn't, not entirely. There is a form of grace in naming the pattern that holds you. She cannot break the loop, but she can make of it something less monstrous by becoming conscious within it. In one iteration, she touches the shoulder of her other self before the mask goes on and whispers a word that sounds like forgiveness. In another, she steps aside a half-pace so the bullet takes a wall instead of an arm. In another, she drops the gull more gently among its kin, a useless kindness, yes, but a human one. The ship keeps time. She keeps faith with small mercies, and who's to say that doesn't matter? We tell ourselves that only exits count, that only endings redeem, but some lives are knots, and the miracle is not the cutting. It is the patience to trace the threads without letting them tighten further. On this vessel, under this sky, with these corridors and this mask, she learns to move in a way that harms less, lies less, hides less. The loop does not praise her. It doesn't punish her either. It simply includes her, which is its own kind of absolution. The final image refuses grandeur. She stands at the rail as the horizon draws itself with a pencil made of light. The sea is that particular blue that only appears after storms. In the distance, the small boat tilts, stubborn and brave, carrying the people she will love and fail and try to save. She does not wave. She does not cry. She breathes as if the air might remember her later. Somewhere below, a bell marks the hour that arrives every time. She turns, picks up the mask with the care you give to heavy things, and walks back into the corridors that have memorized her footsteps. She has many names if you think about her across the iterations, but on paper she's only ever one person. That, I think, is part of the unsettling intimacy of her presence. You're never allowed to file her neatly into one role. She's not the hero, she's not the villain. She's the hinge, the pivot on which the whole cursed geometry swings. And the way she moves through the story feels less like a character arc in the traditional sense, and more like the revelation of a truth that was always there, only hidden under layers of denial, fear, and self-preservation. From the moment she steps onto the deck, she carries that paradox. Someone who wants desperately to protect, and someone who, maybe without realizing it, has the capacity to destroy. She's maternal in flashes, fierce in the face of immediate danger, yet there's an opacity to her that keeps others at arm's length. It's not just that she hides information, it's that she hides pieces of herself. And the more the story unfolds, the more you realize that this isn't a flaw so much as a survival mechanism. On this ship, full transparency would be a death sentence, but of course, withholding has its own cost. You see it first in her eyes. Even in early scenes where she smiles or reassures, there's a part of her gaze that isn't present in the moment. It's searching corridors only she can see. That's what makes her a compelling lead. You're never sure if she's ahead of everyone or simply walking a path she's doomed to retrace. And when the masks come off, literally and figuratively, you understand she's both. This duality is what makes her, to me, one of the most fascinating constructs in psychological horror. Victor is almost her foil in those early beats. He's curious, open, brimming with the kind of optimism that thrives before the rules are known. His trust is untested, which makes him vulnerable but also briefly the moral anchor of the group. His belief in her competence, her intentions, is genuine, and that's why his fate lands with such a weight. It's the transformation of trust into a wound. In a way, his character exists to show us the toll her choices take, not just on her, but on those who give her the benefit of the doubt. Greg, meanwhile, embodies the concept of steady faith. He's practical, even-tempered, and deeply human in the way he measures risk against hope. When he follows her lead, it's not out of naivety, but because he reads in her a kind of reluctant authority. He's the person who doesn't need to understand everything to commit to the plan, which makes his relationship to her almost tragic. In every loop, he's willing to stand beside her until the end, and in every loop, that loyalty is either betrayed or cut short by forces outside his comprehension. I always read Greg as the story's unsung heart. He's not there for spectacle, but his presence adds ballast to the chaos. Sally and Downey work as a pair, not because they lack individuality, but because their survival strategies mesh in a way that binds them together. Sally is instinctively suspicious, the kind of person who has learned to read danger before it's announced. She questions motives, hesitates to follow orders, and her distrust of the protagonist adds a steady undercurrent of tension. Downey, on the other hand, is more reactionary. Fear spikes quickly into defensiveness or aggression. He's not a coward, but he is quick to perceive threats to his own safety, and that makes him unpredictable. Together, they form a kind of counterweight to the protagonist's agenda, forcing her to adjust her tactics, and sometimes exposing her own cracks in judgment. The masked figure is the most complex to talk about because of the reveal, because the mask hides not a stranger, not a pure antagonist, but herself. This shifts the entire framework of how we think about antagonism in the film. The other is not an alien force or an abstract evil, it's an iteration of the same person, a product of the same fears and the same survival instincts, but one that has tipped fully into the predator role. In psychological terms, it's the shadow self, the part of us that emerges when the normal rules of morality are suspended. And what's chilling is how fluid the transition is between the survivor self and the hunter self. The ship doesn't just create doppelgangers, it erodes the boundaries between them. What makes this such a brutal dynamic is that you're watching a woman fight both for her life and against the inevitability of becoming her own worst enemy. That's a conflict no amount of physical combat can win outright. When she finally dons the mask herself, it's not a moment of transformation, it's a moment of recognition. She's been walking toward this version of herself the whole time. The mask is just the formal acknowledgement. The boy, though his screen time is small, is the axis around which her morality spins. In scenes away from the ship, he is her grounding point, the reason she frames herself as a protector, the justification for her choices. But in the flash of domestic violence we see later, he also becomes a mirror reflecting the version of herself she refuses to confront. His silence is devastating because it denies her any absolution. He doesn't condemn her, but he doesn't save her either. In that way, he's a constant presence in her psychology, even when he's not physically in the frame. The taxi driver is an enigma, almost mythological in his function. He's part ferryman, part chorus, part silent witness to the repetition of fate. He doesn't influence events so much as he frames them, offering her passage between stages of the loop. The fact that he reappears across different settings, always with the same calm detachment, gives him a quality of inevitability. He's the embodiment of the system that contains her, polite but unyielding. What's particularly striking in this ensemble is that none of them operate in isolation from the loop. Their arcs, their choices, even their deaths are conditioned by the structure of repetition. This means you can't evaluate their actions in the same moral terms you'd apply to characters in a linear story. Victor's curiosity might have saved them in a different narrative. Here it leads him into a trap. Greg's loyalty would have been heroic in a war film. Here it makes him an easy target. Sally's suspicion could have sparked a smart rebellion, but instead it fractures the group's cohesion. And for the protagonist, every gesture, whether protective or predatory, is filtered through the inevitability of it having already happened before. The fascinating thing about watching them, especially across multiple cycles, is noticing the small changes. The protagonist might hold Sally's gaze a second longer, as if trying to will trust into existence. She might warn Downey earlier, soften her tone with Victor, or take an extra beat before telling Greg what she knows. These micro-adjustments suggest that even within a rigid loop, character is not entirely fixed, it's mutable in increments. Whether those increments matter in the grand scheme is another question entirely, and one the film refuses to answer definitively. In that way, the film becomes a character study, disguised as a supernatural thriller. The real tension isn't just about who lives or dies, it's about whether people can alter themselves in any meaningful way when trapped in a structure that resists change. The protagonist's dual role as both victim and aggressor is the most obvious articulation of that, but it's present in every character. The ship is a pressure cooker that distills each person down to their most defining, and sometimes least flattering, traits. The interplay between these personalities keeps the story alive even when the events repeat. Without Victor's openness, Greg's steadiness, Sally's suspicion, Downey's volatility, the boy's quiet judgment, and the taxi driver's eerie composure, the loops would feel sterile. Instead, they become emotionally volatile, each cycle carrying the weight of all the others. The relationships may reset, but the audience's memory of them doesn't, and that's where the true character development resides, not in the world of the story, but in our perception of them. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. Within the loop, they are both infinitely knowable and forever out of reach. We learn everything about them only to watch that knowledge dissolve as the storm rolls in again, the gangway lowers, and the same introductions play out like clockwork. The characters themselves may never be aware of the full scope of who they are, but we are, and that makes us complicit witnesses to their eternal return. There's something about a film like this, one that folds in on itself, that toys with time and perception, that almost seems destined to generate strange stories behind the camera. And in the case of this production, those stories feel almost as uncanny as the plot itself, as if the film's looping, self-referential DNA seeped into the real world while they were making it. People often imagine that movies with supernatural or psychological elements are accompanied by some whispery, campfire-worthy curse during filming, but the truth here is more interesting. The strangeness wasn't about random accidents. It was about eerie coincidences, creative decisions that came from unexpected places, and the little moments where the boundary between fiction and reality felt porous. One of the most fascinating details I learned is that the ship itself, so integral to the film's atmosphere, was not some elaborate studio build, nor a working cruise liner in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a mix of repurposed vessels, partial sets, and uncanny location work stitched together in a way that mirrored the fragmented, looping corridors in the story. The production team had to find ways to make spaces feel familiar, but not identical, so the audience could feel that something had shifted even when returning to the same place. This meant altering small set pieces between takes, moving a chair a few inches, replacing a framed picture with one almost identical but not quite, scuffing a floor tile in a way it hadn't been scuffed before. Cast members would walk into a space they'd shot in days earlier and feel instantly off balance, unsure what was different. Melissa George, who carried the emotional and physical weight of the film, reportedly experienced an odd kind of déjà vu during shooting, not in the fun way, but in the bone-deep way that makes your skin tighten. She said in one interview that repeating certain scenes multiple times in slightly altered forms began to feel psychologically destabilizing, because she'd lose track of whether she was remembering a previous take or simply anticipating the next one. There were days she'd ask the director, Christopher Smith, "Did we shoot this already, or am I thinking of rehearsal?" A question that could have been lifted straight from her character's own fractured experience. Another odd tidbit involves the weather during filming. The storm sequences were a mix of practical effects, controlled water tanks, and on-location shoots in conditions that were less than pleasant. While the film's fictional storm is abrupt and unnerving, the real-life weather played its own tricks. On more than one occasion, the crew would set up for a calm water scene only for an unforecasted shift in wind and cloud cover to change the entire lighting and texture of the ocean. They began to joke that the sea itself was in on it, deliberately giving them unpredictable versions of the same background, like the environment wanted to be part of the loop. There was also a strange superstition among the crew about the ship's gangway. It wasn't a permanent fixture. It was set dressing brought in for specific shots, but on at least 3 different mornings, members of the art department swore they'd found it already lowered when they arrived, even though it had been dismantled and stored the night before. There was never any logical explanation for this. Someone would shrug, blame it on a miscommunication, and get on with the day. But the joke became, "She's waiting for you," a reference to the unseen force in the story that lures people aboard. One of my favorite production quirks is how they managed the masked figures movement. The mask itself was unsettling in its simplicity, smooth, featureless, neither overtly male nor female. The person under it had to move with a kind of purposeful ambiguity, so stunt coordinators worked with the actor to strip away identifiable tics. No swinging arms, no distinct gait, no reactive head tilts. The result was this eerie glide, a presence that felt intentional but unreadable. Interestingly, they shot several scenes with different people under the mask, Melissa George herself, the stunt double, and even a crew member, just to give the figure an inconsistent body language that you couldn't quite pin down. There's also an obscure but brilliant detail involving props. You know how in the film there are repeated objects, a pile of keys, a dropped locket, a scrap of cloth? Well, the art department didn't make just one version of each. They made dozens with subtle differences in wear and aging, so that every time you saw them, they felt like echoes rather than exact duplicates. This created a subliminal sense that time was fractured, not a perfect cycle, but a rough copy of a copy of a copy, each loop decaying slightly from the last. Most viewers wouldn't consciously notice, but your brain does, and it's part of what gives the repetition in the film that uncanny, dreamlike flavor. Casting also had its own set of uncanny moments. Several of the supporting actors described feeling an immediate, instinctive connection with their counterparts, almost like they'd met before. In a weird way, that helped sell the illusion of characters who have lived through these events more than once. One actor even joked that it was like being introduced to someone you've already had a long conversation with in another life. Whether that was just chemistry or something stranger, it worked to the film's advantage. The production schedule was unusually tight, which meant they often had to shoot key emotional scenes back-to-back, with physically demanding sequences. Melissa George might spend the morning navigating an emotional breakdown in one take, and the afternoon running drenched through narrow corridors in another. The exhaustion was real, and she's admitted that it sometimes blurred the line between acting and genuine disorientation. In a way, this mirrored her character's own mental and physical collapse, lending authenticity to performances that could have easily felt exaggerated in lesser hands. Sound design became another place where reality and fiction intertwined. Many of the echoing footsteps, distant thuds, and muffled voices weren't fully fabricated in post-production. They were recorded live on set in the ship's hollow corridors. This gave the audio a kind of organic eeriness you can't fake, because the ship's natural acoustics warped and stretched the sounds in unpredictable ways. The crew even discovered phantom noises while listening back, faint creaks or murmurs that hadn't been present during filming. They left some of them in, unedited, because they added to the atmosphere. One detail that always amuses me is how often cast and crew would get physically lost on set. Because of the way the ship interiors were dressed and redressed for different parts of the loop, a hallway that led somewhere yesterday might lead somewhere entirely different today. A few times, people wandered into an active camera setup by accident, not realizing they stepped into a live corridor. Smith reportedly loved this. It meant the disorientation on screen wasn't entirely fabricated. And then there's the seagull, not the one in the story, but a real one that became something of a mascot during production. It appeared on the dock almost every morning during the ship scenes, watching with that inscrutable bird gaze as people bustled around. The crew started calling it the Sentinel, and when it stopped showing up near the end of the shoot, some joked it had gone back to whatever strange loop it had come from. Coincidence, of course, but in the context of this movie, everything feels a little suspect. Perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about the film, S-making, is that so many of its uncanny textures weren't planned as horror beats. They emerged naturally from the constraints and conditions of the shoot. The shifting weather, the repetitive set dressing, the confusion of long days in similar but not identical hallways. The movie's unsettling atmosphere isn't just the product of post-production. It's baked into the footage, born out of genuine disorientation and the strange psychology of doing the same thing, with the same people in slightly different ways, over and over again. It's fitting, isn't it? A story about being trapped in a repeating cycle ends up being made in a way that traps its own cast and crew in miniature versions of that cycle. The difference is, they got to walk away when it wrapped. At least I think they did. Some stories have a way of following you home, and I can't help but imagine that for a few people who worked on this, there are moments, standing in a hallway, hearing an unplaceable sound, when they wonder if they've really left the ship behind. There's something uniquely challenging about unpacking a story like this one, not because it hides its cards, but because it plays them over and over, each time at a slightly different angle, forcing you to question whether you ever truly saw them in the first place. When you start to approach it from a critical perspective, it becomes clear that the events aren't simply a chain of cause and effect, but rather a kind of narrative spiral, where each revolution brings you close enough to recognize the shape, yet far enough to miss the fine details. That spiral structure is more than a gimmick, it's the framework that supports the film's entire thematic architecture, and the specific events within it are its pressure points. The arrival at the dock is the first of those points. On paper, it's an innocuous scene, a group of friends and acquaintances meeting for a day on the water. But look closer, and the dock becomes a liminal space, a threshold between the ordinary world and the strange, self-contained purgatory they're about to enter. From a literary standpoint, this is a classic rite of passage moment, but it's warped by the knowledge that it will repeat. The first time we see it, it's functional exposition. Later, it's an omen. And by the time it plays out again in different contexts, it's almost unbearable, a reminder that the cycle is tightening, that escape is as illusory as the calm surface of the sea. Then there's the storm. In traditional narrative analysis, the storm often symbolizes chaos, transformation, or the intervention of uncontrollable forces. Here, it's all of those, but it's also something colder, a mechanical trigger in the loop. It doesn't feel like an act of nature so much as a system reset, the point where the world's logic is forcibly overwritten. Watching it critically, you notice how quickly the group loses control, how each person's behavior in the face of disaster becomes a miniature thesis statement about their character. Victor tries to help, Greg attempts to stabilize, Sally retreats into skepticism, and the protagonist slips into a kind of heightened vigilance. The storm is less about the waves than about stripping away pretense. The discovery of the empty ship is where the narrative starts to tilt toward the uncanny, and from a structural standpoint, it's brilliant. An empty space in literature and film isn't just absence, it's a mirror. The ship is physically there, detailed and solid, but its lack of occupants throws the group's own presence into sharp relief. From a symbolic perspective, the ship is a manifestation of the loop itself. Massive, inescapable, and devoid of external context, it doesn't belong to a wider world. It exists only to contain them. The way the camera lingers on hallways and doorways without anyone in them creates a sense that the ship is both waiting and remembering, as if it knows they've been here before. The first attack by the masked figure is the moment where the narrative's dual structure, thriller and metaphysical puzzle, fully locks into place. In a straightforward genre reading, it's a stockhand/beat, designed to jar the group into survival mode. But the mask changes everything. Masks in art have always represented the split between appearance and reality, between the face we show and the face we hide. Here, the mask becomes the ultimate metaphor for the self as both victim and aggressor. The fact that it conceals a familiar face transforms the attack from an external threat into an existential one. The protagonist isn't just running from danger, she's running from the inevitability of becoming it. From a critical lens, one of the most potent scenes is the protagonist's interaction with Victor in the corridor, the moment she tries to warn him, only for things to spiral into violence. It's not just a turning point for their dynamic, it's an articulation of the central paradox. Her attempts to change the outcome are precisely what lock the outcome in place. This is the Ouroboros of fatalism. Action intended to break the cycle becomes the fuel that sustains it. Watching it through that lens, the tragedy isn't that she fails to save Victor, it's that in trying to, she ensures he can't be saved. The repeated pile of dead seagulls is perhaps the most overtly symbolic element in the film, and from a literary standpoint, it's a devastating one. In myth and folklore, birds often represent the soul, freedom, or the passage between worlds. Here their accumulation signals the decay of each cycle. Every time the loop restarts, another bird falls, another iteration is marked. It's a visual manifestation of entropy within the system, a reminder that even in repetition, there's a slow, grinding erosion. The image is so quietly horrifying because it suggests that while the characters may not age or change in ways they can perceive, the world around them is keeping score. And then there's the reveal that the masked figure is her, not a stranger. In terms of narrative impact, it's a masterstroke, but from a thematic perspective, it's the culmination of the story's examination of identity under pressure. The loop isn't a prison imposed by an outside force. It's a structure built from her own choices, her own inability, or refusal, to confront the truth of who she is. The reveal reframes every earlier event. The storm isn't just a weather pattern, it's the emotional rupture she can't outrun. The empty ship isn't a mystery to solve, it's the hollow echo of her own mind. The mask isn't a disguise. It's the face she wears when she gives up pretending she's innocent. The domestic sequence on land is where the narrative shifts from metaphysical to brutally personal. We see the version of her life she's been trying to return to, and it's not the safe harbor we might have imagined. The glimpses of anger, of control, of the strained relationship with her child tear away the illusion that the loop is purely a supernatural punishment. It's also a form of self-enacted penance, a place where she can try, again and again, to be the better version of herself she couldn't sustain in the real world. The taxi ride that follows becomes an almost mythological passage, a ferrying between realms. The driver's calm, almost detached demeanor reads differently when you start thinking of him as a psychopomp, a guide who can't interfere, only deliver. From a reception standpoint, these events divided audiences. Some viewers saw the repetition and ambiguity as thrillingly cerebral, a puzzle worth untangling. Others found it frustrating, even alienating, because it denied them the catharsis of a clean resolution. That divide is telling, because it mirrors the central tension of the film itself, the desire to believe that with enough effort, clarity and escape are possible, versus the acceptance that some cycles aren't meant to be broken. Critics who championed the film often cited its commitment to this tension as its greatest strength, refusing to compromise for the sake of accessibility. Emotionally, the film's resonance comes from the way these events stack, not just within the narrative, but within us as viewers. Each time the dock scene plays out, it doesn't just remind us of where the story started, it reminds us of where we, as an audience, have been taken since the last time we saw it. Each attack isn't just suspense, it's a reframing of our knowledge about who is under the mask. Each death isn't just a loss, it's another weight on the scale that tips toward inevitability. By the time the cycle completes, we've experienced our own form of narrative déjà vu, caught between wanting it to change and knowing it won't. In this way, the film becomes less about its literal events and more about the emotional architecture they create. The dock is the threshold, the storm is the rupture, the empty ship is the mirror, the mask is the shadow self, the domestic sequence is the truth, the taxi ride is the surrender. Every loop is another turn of the screw, another tightening of the story's grip, not because it's forcing us to watch the same thing, but because it's teaching us how to see it differently each time. That, I think, is why it lingers long after the credits roll, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a feeling you can't quite shake, the sense that somewhere, right now, it's all happening again. It's easy to imagine a film like this emerging, fully formed from the mind of its creator, as if the looping corridors and shifting timelines were always there, waiting for someone to capture them on camera. But the truth is far messier, and infinitely more fascinating. The making of this film wasn't just a matter of executing a script, it was an exercise in building an environment where repetition and disorientation could be manufactured on demand, without losing the emotional core of the story. Every choice, from the way the sets were designed to the way scenes were scheduled, was part of a deliberate effort to keep both the cast and the audience teetering on the edge of clarity and confusion. Christopher Smith, the director, reportedly approached the project as a puzzle to be assembled in real time, rather than a straightforward shoot. He understood from the beginning that the story's power lay in its structure, and that the visual and tonal consistency of each loop would be critical. But here's the tricky part: too much consistency, and the repetition becomes tedious. Too little, and the loops lose their eerie cohesion. The production design team had to walk this razor's edge, creating sets that were identical enough to be recognizable, yet altered in subtle ways to plant the feeling that something you couldn't quite name, was different this time around. One of the earliest and most complex decisions involved the ship. In most thrillers set on large vessels, the location is a real, working ship or an elaborate studio build. Here, it was neither. They used a combination of real maritime locations, repurposed industrial spaces, and partial sets that could be redressed between takes. This not only allowed them to control lighting and camera placement, but also gave them the flexibility to change the geography of the ship subtly between loops. The corridor might be lit from a different angle, a doorway might shift position, or the furniture arrangement in a dining area might alter just enough to make even the actors hesitate. Cast members later said that these micro-adjustments had a real effect. They'd walk into a set certain they'd been there before, but unable to pinpoint why it felt wrong. The loop structure of the film created unusual challenges for continuity. Normally, a continuity supervisor ensures that every detail from one shot matches the next, so the audience isn't pulled out of the story. But here, continuity had to be incorrect in very controlled ways. The supervisor's job became almost philosophical, tracking not just what was supposed to be the same, but what was supposed to be slightly different, and ensuring that the difference felt accidental rather than intentional. This required meticulous documentation, with notes and photographs for each iteration of a scene. They even had loop maps on set, charts showing which version of a scene they were filming that day, where in the cycle it occurred, and which details should be altered. Melissa George, who carried the weight of the entire narrative, bore the brunt of these structural complexities. She wasn't just playing one version of her character, she was playing multiple, subtly different versions of her, often in the same shooting day. The emotional calibration required for this was staggering. One moment, she'd be in the early stages of confusion, trying to keep the group together. The next, she'd be in full-on survival mode, hardened by knowledge of what was coming. The crew said she kept a kind of personal, emotional continuity chart in her own notes, separate from the official ones, to remind herself where her character's headspace should be in each version. The masked figure scenes added another layer of complexity. The identity of the figure was the film's central mystery, so even on set, there was a degree of secrecy about who was wearing the mask in any given shot. Sometimes it was Melissa George herself. Other times, it was a stunt performer or even a stand-in from the crew. This served two purposes. It kept the physicality of the figure slightly inconsistent, and it allowed the team to shoot over-the-shoulder or long-distance shots without revealing too much. Watching the raw footage, you can see how this decision built the feeling of unease. You can't quite read the figure's movements, because they're a patchwork of different bodies inhabiting the same silhouette. Weather played a surprisingly large role in the production process. The storm sequences, for example, were achieved through a combination of practical effects in a controlled water tank and locations shooting on choppier seas. But nature, as always, refused to cooperate entirely. On at least 2 occasions, the crew set up for calm water scenes only to have the wind kick up, changing the ocean's surface from glassy to rippled in a matter of minutes. Rather than fight it, Smith decided to incorporate these inconsistencies into the film. The sea, like the ship, became part of the loop, sometimes docile, sometimes hostile, always unpredictable. The sound design began long before post-production. The ship's interiors were recorded extensively during filming to capture their natural acoustics. Every creak, every echoing footstep, every metallic clang was harvested for later use. Some of these were used in unexpected places. For example, a creak recorded in a storage hallway might later be layered into a dining room scene, subtly warping the audience's sense of space. The sound team also discovered strange, phantom noises in their recordings, faint murmurs, distant knocks, that hadn't been heard during filming. They kept a few of these in the final mix, leaning into the eerie ambiguity of whether they were real or imagined. Wardrobe had its own share of unique challenges. Costumes had to look identical enough to match across loops, but also had to show subtle signs of wear, or even damage, that corresponded to specific points in the cycle. A shirt might be slightly wrinkled in one iteration, blood-stained in another, and pristine in the one before. The costume department worked in tandem with continuity to ensure that these changes felt organic to the character's journey. They even made multiple versions of key wardrobe pieces with varying degrees of distress, so they could switch them out without relying on artificial aging between takes. One of the most interesting behind-the-scenes dynamics was the cast's gradual immersion into the film's structure. At first, they approached each loop as a discrete scene, focusing on the immediate beats. But as filming progressed, they began to feel the weight of the repetition. Even though they weren't trapped in the loop like their characters, the process of restaging similar scenes over and over began to create its own psychological pressure. Some cast members joked that they'd dream about walking down the same hallway for hours, unable to find an exit. Christopher Smith encouraged this sense of disorientation. He often withheld certain pieces of information from the actors, especially in earlier takes, so their reactions would be genuine. In one sequence, a prop was moved to an unexpected location just before the cameras rolled. The confusion on the actors' faces was real. They were reacting not to a scripted change, but to the unsettling realization that their mental map of the set had been altered. There's also the matter of the seagulls, which became an unofficial symbol for the production. The art department created several realistic seagull props for the recurring pile shots, each with its own subtle differences. But during location shoots, real seagulls often appeared in the background, sometimes in exactly the spots where their prop counterparts had been placed. It happened often enough that the crew started keeping count, half joking that the birds were in the loop, too. The editing process was as intricate as the shoot itself. Smith and his editor had to decide how much information to reveal in each loop, how much to withhold, and when to let the audience start piecing things together. They experimented with different versions of certain sequences, moving scenes forward or backward in the structure to see how it affected the overall rhythm. The result is a cut that feels both inevitable and surprising, as though the events could only unfold in this precise order, even though you know they could have been arranged differently. Despite the film's intricate construction, there was room for improvisation. In one of the most tense chase sequences, a prop door jammed unexpectedly, forcing Melissa George to physically fight with it in the take. The frustration on her face is genuine, and the moment made it into the final cut because it perfectly matched her character's growing desperation. Similarly, a slip on a wet deck wasn't planned, but it worked so well in the context of the scene that they kept it. Looking back at the production, what stands out most is how the making of the film mirrored its story. The repetition, the subtle shifts, the confusion over what was real and what was staged, these weren't just themes on paper. They were part of the daily reality of shooting. The crew wasn't just building a loop on screen, they were living their own miniature version of one. And while they could pack up the sets and walk away when it was over, there's a lingering sense that some part of that experience followed them home, the way a half-remembered dream clings to you long after you wake. The ocean is the first great stage upon which this story begins to unfold, and from the very first frame, it's not presented as a postcard backdrop or an idyllic expanse of blue, but as a living, unpredictable force. There's a sense of openness that's both liberating and threatening, like standing on the edge of a void that could swallow you whole. The water shimmers under sunlight in some moments, but in others, its glassy surface feels unnatural, almost like a trap. The cinematography treats the sea not as scenery, but as an active participant, always shifting, always reflecting the emotional undercurrents of the characters. The horizon is often framed wide, a thin dividing line between sky and sea, and that horizontal symmetry creates a false sense of stability. You know it won't last. When the storm comes, that horizon disappears entirely. The sky turns slate gray, clouds heaving like some monstrous lung, and the water churns with the kind of violence that feels almost intimate. It's not the grand, towering waves of a seafaring epic, but a constant, chaotic battering that keeps the camera and the audience off balance. The choice to shoot much of this sequence with handheld, close-range framing pulls you into the middle of it. You feel the rain slap against the lens, the wind distort the sound, the water splash into the actors' faces. It's not polished, and that's the point. The storm is messy, claustrophobic, and confusing, an emotional prelude to the psychological chaos waiting just beyond it. Then there's the ship. If the ocean is infinite and formless, the ship is its opposite, rigid, towering, and enclosed, a floating labyrinth. Its very design is an exercise in contradiction. At first glance, it looks functional, a straightforward vessel with broad decks and industrial corridors. But the longer the camera lingers, the more wrong it begins to feel. The corridors are too long, the symmetry too perfect, the lighting inconsistent from one section to the next. The production team built sets that could be redressed and rearranged so that the geography of the ship subtly shifted between scenes. It's never quite the same hallway twice. This slight warping of space creates an unconscious tension. You feel that you should be able to map it, but you can't. The lighting inside the ship is its own character. In some sequences, it's bathed in the warm yellow of old incandescent bulbs, evoking an almost nostalgic coziness. But that warmth is deceptive, because the very next moment it can swing to stark fluorescence, bleaching every surface into something cold and clinical. The transitions are rarely obvious. Often, you realize halfway through a scene that the color temperature has shifted, and the set now feels alien. This is a deliberate choice. Lighting cues the audience's emotional response without calling attention to itself, pulling you deeper into the loop's disorientation. One of the most effective atmospheric tricks is the ship's soundscape. The visual setting is eerie enough, but the audio transforms it into something oppressive. Every space has its own unique acoustic fingerprint. The hollow ring of footsteps in a metal hallway, the faint drip of unseen water, the low thrum of distant machinery. These sounds recur from loop to loop, but they are never perfectly identical. Sometimes the drip is louder, sometimes the machinery hum has a strange harmonic to it. Like the shifting sets, these variations work on you in the background, making you feel uneasy without quite knowing why. The deck of the ship is framed in ways that heighten its isolation. The vast ocean surrounding it becomes a flat, featureless void, stripping away the romanticism of open water. Shots are composed so that the ship feels stranded not just physically, but metaphysically, existing outside of normal time. There's rarely any visible motion in the surrounding water once they board, which lends the unsettling sense that the ship isn't moving at all, even though they're in the middle of the ocean. It's not a vessel in transit, it's a prison disguised as transport. Cinematography plays a huge role in enhancing the story's sense of disorientation. Camera movements are often subtle and deliberate in early scenes, tracking characters in medium shots as they explore the ship. But as the loops begin to reveal themselves, the camera starts to mirror the protagonist's mental state, becoming jittery, darting between perspectives, or lingering too long on a seemingly irrelevant detail. Sometimes the framing is just a little too close, pressing into the actors' faces until you feel the breathlessness of their panic. At other times, it pulls back abruptly, shrinking them into the vastness of the corridor, making them look like tiny, trapped figures in an endless maze. Color is another key storytelling device. The film's palette shifts according to the narrative's emotional rhythm. The storm and early ship scenes are dominated by muted blues and grays, evoking coldness and detachment. Later, as the loops intensify, deep reds and oranges begin to seep into the frame, blood against metal, rust on the ship's railings, the glow of a dying light bulb. These warm tones clash with the setting's industrial coolness, creating visual tension that mirrors the narrative's escalation. By the final act, the palette is a swirl of both extremes, a visual representation of the collapse between control and chaos. The costume design subtly complements the setting's atmosphere. Characters' clothing changes from crisp and clean at the start to progressively disheveled, stained, and torn. This degradation isn't just about survival wear and tear, it's a visual cue of the psychological unraveling. The protagonist's appearance shifts in such small increments that you might not consciously notice at first, but by the time the loop has tightened, she looks like a different person entirely. And because loops overlap, you sometimes see earlier versions of her side by side with the later versions, creating a jarring visual reminder that time isn't functioning normally here. The use of mirrors and reflective surfaces is another quiet but powerful choice. The ship is full of polished metal, glass panels, and glistening puddles on the floor, all of which provide opportunities for distorted reflections. The camera sometimes catches the protagonist's reflection in ways that feel almost accidental, glimpses of her from angles she couldn't possibly see herself from. These moments build the sense that she's being watched, or perhaps watching herself, feeding into the theme of self-confrontation. Even the natural elements within the setting are weaponized for mood. The sunlight that sometimes pours into the ship's upper decks is overexposed, harsh, almost blinding, offering no real comfort. In contrast, the shadows in lower areas are deep and consuming, leaving just enough detail to suggest movement in the dark. This interplay of light and shadow mirrors the psychological push and pull between denial and recognition, safety and danger. Editing and pacing tie all of these cinematic elements together. Cuts are sometimes deliberately abrupt, breaking spatial continuity in a way that makes you feel as if you've just skipped forward in time without consent. In other places, the camera lingers far too long on an empty corridor or an unmoving door, stretching the moment until it becomes unbearable. These decisions manipulate the viewer's perception of time, drawing you into the same warped experience the characters are trapped in. One of the most disquieting aspects of the setting is that it never offers true sanctuary. In many thrillers, you can identify safe spaces, brightly lit rooms, higher ground, locked doors. Here, every environment has its own threat embedded in it. The decks are exposed to the unknown of the ocean. The corridors are too tight to run through easily. The cabins and dining areas are riddled with blind spots where danger could emerge at any moment. The ship isn't a location you move through. It's a presence you live inside, and it seems to be aware of you. And then there's the loop itself, woven into the physicality of the setting. Objects accumulate. Dropped keys, scattered shells, bloodstains, the body count itself. These artifacts linger into the next cycle, piling up like the debris of memory that can't be scrubbed away. The setting holds onto these remnants, and the cinematography makes sure we see them, not as blatant clues, but as environmental storytelling. It's the kind of detail that rewards repeat viewings, because the more you notice, the more you realize the ship itself is telling the story alongside the characters. All of these elements, the mutable geography, the shifting light, the ocean's duality, the oppressive sound design, combine to create a space that is more than just a backdrop. It's a living metaphor for the psychological state of the protagonist. It's both the battleground and the enemy, the reflection and the trap, and the brilliance of the film's visual language is that you never quite get used to it. Even after the credits roll, that ship lingers in your mind's eye, a place both real and impossible, adrift somewhere in the middle of the sea and in the center of a looping nightmare you can't wake from. From the outside, the making of a psychological thriller like this might seem like a straightforward exercise: tight script, atmospheric set, a handful of actors, a contained environment. But the truth is that building something this intricate behind the camera requires a kind of discipline and collaboration that's as complex as the looping story it tells. The set may have looked like a massive, weather-worn ship drifting in the middle of an ocean, but the reality was far from that. Most of it was built piece by piece in carefully controlled spaces, each section designed to be taken apart, rearranged, and dressed differently so that it could appear as multiple locations. The production team started with an almost obsessive approach to detail. The ship's interiors weren't just painted sets. They were weathered, distressed, and aged so that every pipe, rivet, and shadow told a story. The art department kept buckets of rust powder and grease on hand to apply between takes, making sure the ship looked lived in, haunted even, no matter which loop the characters were inhabiting at the time. The director was adamant that no environment should ever look exactly the same twice, not even if the scene was repeating, and that meant the crew had to reset details with surgical precision. This led to one of the most unique challenges on set. Continuity wasn't about keeping everything identical, it was about tracking subtle differences. The script supervisor's notes became legendary among the crew. They had detailed charts for each loop, showing where every dropped bullet casing landed, which blood smears were fresh, and which had dried into dark, crusted stains. Even the smallest prop, a key, a shoe, a scrap of torn fabric, was cataloged and placed in multiple versions, one for each time it reappeared in the timeline. The actors quickly discovered that performing in this environment was unlike anything they'd done before. Instead of simply tracking their characters, emotional arcs from beginning to end, they had to jump in and out of different versions of themselves, sometimes playing a scene where they were shocked and disoriented, and the very next take portraying a version who had been through it all before. There were days when Melissa George, who played the lead, had to film the first time she boarded the ship in the morning, then switch to a third loop version of herself after lunch, complete with a different body language, tone of voice, and level of desperation. It was exhausting, but it gave her performance that unsettling elasticity the story demanded. One of the more light-hearted behind-the-scenes moments came from the masked antagonist sequences. The identity of that figure is, of course, a pivotal twist in the film, but on set, the costume caused all sorts of logistical comedy. The mask was unnerving in person, blank, cold, expressionless, but it also severely limited vision. There were countless takes where the stunt performer accidentally walked into walls, tripped on steps, or missed a mark entirely because they couldn't see through the eye slits. The crew started joking that the mask had its own curse, and someone even made a miniature cardboard version to hang on the craft services table as a kind of protective charm. Filming the storm sequence early in the movie posed another massive hurdle. The production didn't have the budget for a full-scale ocean shoot with towering waves, so they built the deck of the boat on a gimbal rig in a water tank. Industrial fans blasted wind at impossible speeds, while giant hoses poured sheets of water onto the actors. The combination of slippery surfaces, soaking costumes, and the physical demand of fighting the elements meant that everyone went home bruised and exhausted those days. But the camaraderie it built was undeniable. Crew members huddled with the actors between takes, sharing towels and jokes, turning what could have been miserable into a shared adventure. The director had an almost literary vision for the film, and that extended to how scenes were rehearsed. Before shooting certain key sequences, particularly the ones where the loops begin to fracture the audience's sense of time, the cast would sit together and read not just the scene they were about to film, but the parallel scenes from earlier or later in the story. This gave them an immediate sense of how the beats would echo across the narrative. It also sparked impromptu discussions about character motivation and thematic layering, often leading to small but powerful performance adjustments. One surprising technical challenge was the sound. The ship's interiors were often shot on real metal surfaces, and every footstep, dropped object, or clink of a prop reverberated like a bell. The sound team had to get creative, laying down hidden padding in key spots or lining props with soft materials so they wouldn't ring too loudly. But there were also moments when the echo was embraced, particularly in scenes where isolation was the emotional goal. In those moments, the sound department would deliberately mic the set to capture the hollow, distant quality of a voice traveling down a corridor, making the space feel even more deserted. Then there was the issue of shooting multiple versions of the same scene. Normally, when a film has to redo a moment, it's because something went wrong, bad lighting, missed lines, technical glitch. Here, redoing was built into the script, and the trick was to make each one feel like part of a growing spiral rather than a mechanical reset. The director and cinematographer designed each repetition with a visual shift, a slightly different angle, a longer hold on a prop, a change in depth of field, so that even when you were watching the same moment, you were seeing it with fresh eyes. Melissa George often remarked in interviews that the hardest part wasn't the physical endurance of filming on the ship set or the tank, it was holding onto the emotional map of her character. "It's like playing chess against yourself," she once said, "and every time you make a move, you have to remember all the moves you've already made and the ones you'll make in the future." The crew became her unofficial memory bank, reminding her between takes which version she was in. Despite the intensity of the subject matter, there was a surprising amount of laughter on set. The confined space, the looping timelines, the endless resetting of props, it could easily have driven everyone stir-crazy, but instead, it created a kind of inside joke among the team. The crew nicknamed the ship the Hotel California because, like the lyrics, you could check out anytime you liked, but you could never leave. The final days of filming were some of the most challenging. The ending required both emotional precision and practical problem-solving. Certain shots had to match perfectly with earlier scenes to maintain the loop illusion, which meant the lighting, blocking, and even the weather outside the set had to be identical. The production scheduled those scenes months apart, but still managed to create seamless matches, a testament to the meticulous planning of the cinematographer and continuity team. What's remarkable is how these behind-the-scenes challenges and quirks seem to echo the themes of the film itself. Just as the characters are caught in a cycle they can't escape, the cast and crew found themselves repeating actions over and over, making tiny adjustments, chasing a sense of perfection that was always just one more take away. But unlike the characters, they eventually did escape, wrapping production with a mixture of relief and bittersweet nostalgia for a project that demanded so much of them. Looking back, many of the people who worked on the film speak of it with a certain reverence. It wasn't a massive blockbuster or a franchise tentpole, but it was an intricate, challenging, and deeply collaborative work of art. And in the end, the ship they built, both the physical one on set and the metaphorical one they sailed together, still floats in the minds of everyone who stepped aboard. Some films wrap their meaning in layers of narrative, so thick that you can watch them a dozen times and still feel like you're circling the truth rather than landing on it. This one is like that, built less like a straight road and more like a Möbius strip, where every thematic element folds back on itself until you can't tell which side you're walking on. At first glance, it might seem like a cleverly structured thriller with a supernatural edge, but under that surface lies something much deeper, a meditation on guilt, the inevitability of consequence, and the human mind's need to rewrite its own history, even when doing so traps it in the very cycles it wants to escape. The most obvious thematic backbone is the idea of repetition, not just as a narrative device, but as a psychological prison. In the story, events fold in on themselves, characters revisit the same beats from slightly altered angles, and time becomes less a linear force and more a circular current pulling them under. This looping structure isn't just a clever trick to keep the audience guessing, it's a mirror for the way guilt operates. When you've done something you can't forgive yourself for, your mind replays it endlessly, each time convincing you that you might find a way to change it, to soften its edges, to justify it. But the truth is, every replay only reinforces the reality that it happened, and that you can't undo it. The film takes that emotional truth and turns it into a literal landscape. That looping is anchored by one of the most striking pieces of symbolism, the ship itself. On the surface, it's just the setting, a vast, silent, seemingly abandoned vessel adrift at sea. But in the symbolic language of the story, it's more than that. The ship is a purgatory, a self-contained universe where the rules of time and logic are warped to keep its inhabitants trapped. It's not a place they stumbled into, it's a place that seems to have been waiting for them, built out of their own unfinished business. Every corridor, every shadowed staircase, every echoing footstep feels like a physical manifestation of the mind when it's stuck in rumination. Familiar, oppressive, and impossible to escape because it is, in essence, you. Even the way the ship is designed visually reinforces this idea. The long hallways create a vanishing point perspective that suggests infinity, while the repeated doorways and staircases lead to spaces that feel almost identical to ones we've seen before. This architectural sameness is disorienting, and that disorientation is the point. It traps both the characters and the audience in a place where every path feels like it might lead somewhere new, but ultimately loops you back to where you started. If the ship is the mind, then the masked figure is the shadow self, the part of you that contains everything you've tried to suppress or deny. In mythology and Jungian psychology alike, the shadow is the unacknowledged part of your personality, often containing impulses or truths you find unacceptable. The mask strips away individuality, it could be anyone under there, and then comes the devastating reveal, it's her, it always was. That moment isn't just a plot twist, it's a symbolic unmasking of the self, a confrontation with the fact that the danger you've been running from is the person you already are. The mask itself is fascinating from a symbolic standpoint. Its blankness is unnerving, but it's also oddly neutral, as if daring the viewer to project whatever they fear most onto it. It's the perfect visual metaphor for self-confrontation. You're looking at a face that reflects nothing back at you, forcing you to fill it with your own meaning. That's why the reveal hits so hard. It's not just that she's the villain in her own story. It's that the face she feared was always the one she lived with. Another recurring symbol is the dead seagulls washing up on the shore. On a literal level, they're just animals caught in some mysterious environmental loop. But symbolically, they function as a kind of tally, marking each failed attempt to break the cycle. Birds in literature have often been associated with freedom, the soul, or transcendence. They move between worlds in a way humans can't. Here, their repeated deaths feel like an inversion of that symbolism, a reminder that escape isn't possible, that each cycle ends the same way, and that every supposed reset is just another step toward decay. They're the physical proof that the loop isn't a clean circle, it's a spiral that descends. Even the storm, which seems at first like a classic thriller catalyst, carries heavy thematic weight. Storms have long been symbols of chaos and transformation, but this one feels mechanical, almost inevitable. It's less the hand of nature and more the flick of a cosmic switch, resetting the board for another round. In that sense, it represents the emotional rupture, the moment when control slips away and the loop reasserts itself. You can survive the storm, but it will come again, exactly as it did before, and surviving doesn't mean escaping. The domestic scenes late in the story reframe everything. We've spent so much time trapped in the surreal logic of the ship that seeing the protagonist in her real-world environment is jarring. But it's here that the themes snap into focus. The strained relationship with her child, the flashes of anger, the inability to face her own shortcomings, these are the real ghosts haunting her. The ship isn't just a mysterious location. It's an emotional construct, built from the parts of herself she can't reconcile. The loop is her mind trying, over and over, to rewrite a narrative that keeps ending the same way because she can't, or won't, change herself. The taxi ride that closes the story is perhaps the most haunting symbol of all. It's calm, almost gentle, a quiet after the chaos. But in mythic terms, it's a ferry ride across the river Styx, with the driver as a modern-day psychopomp, an escort to whatever comes next. That next isn't peace or resolution, but another turn of the loop, another cycle beginning under the guise of starting over. It's the perfect encapsulation of the film's worldview. The end is the beginning, not because of some grand cosmic design, but because the human heart can be its own captor. Thematically, the story sits at the intersection of fate and agency. Are the characters doomed because some supernatural force is toying with them, or because they make the same choices every time? The film never answers outright, and that ambiguity is the point. By refusing to define the loop's origin, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that we might be responsible for our own traps, that the cycles in our lives aren't always imposed from the outside, but built brick by brick from the inside. This is why the events hit so differently for different viewers. Some see it as a puzzle to solve, a narrative riddle with a clean answer waiting to be uncovered. Others feel it as a mood piece, a meditation on the inescapable patterns of human behavior. In both readings, the emotional impact is the same, a gnawing sense that, whether by fate or by choice, we walk the same corridors over and over, wearing different masks but arriving at the same locked door. Even the cinematography works as thematic reinforcement. The shift from bright, open shots in the beginning to tighter, darker framing as the loop takes hold mirrors the narrowing of possibilities. Early on, the ocean feels vast. Later, it feels like a wall. The lighting on the ship shifts from cool, clinical blues to warmer, almost suffocating ambers as the protagonist gets closer to unmasking herself, suggesting that self-awareness can be both illuminating and unbearable. The sound design, too, plays with symbolism. The echo of footsteps in the ship's corridors doesn't just tell us someone is coming, it tells us that someone has been here before, maybe many times before. The clanging of metal, the creak of doors, the distant hum of unseen machinery, they all suggest a system that's alive but indifferent, a place that will keep functioning with or without you. Perhaps the most unsettling theme is that of memory and perception. The protagonist doesn't have a god's-eye view of the loop. She experiences each cycle as if it's happening for the first time, until fragments of memory bleed through. This mirrors the way trauma can resurface, not as a neat, linear recollection, but as flashes, impressions, moments that intrude into the present without warning. The more she tries to control it, the more entangled she becomes, until her own attempts to steer the narrative become the very engine that powers it. And in the end, that might be the most profound takeaway. The loop isn't a punishment handed down from some external judge. It's an internal reckoning, a private purgatory where the self is both prisoner and warden. The symbols, the ship, the mask, the seagulls, the storm, aren't just narrative devices. They're facets of the same truth, refracted through the language of suspense and horror. You can read it as fate, you can read it as psychology, you can even read it as both. But whichever lens you choose, you're left with the same lingering image. A figure standing on a deck, staring into a horizon that never comes any closer, ready to start again, knowing deep down that it will all happen the same way. Would you like me to now craft the conclusion section for this film in the same narrative style and 3,500 words as we've been doing? There's a certain quiet that comes after a film like this ends, a kind of stunned stillness where you realize you've been holding your breath, not because you were afraid exactly, but because you were bracing for something you couldn't quite name. And now that it's over, you're left with that strange mix of emotions you get after a particularly vivid dream, disoriented, unsettled, and maybe even a little reluctant to let go of the world you've just been wandering through. We've covered a lot of ground together, tracing the film's labyrinth from the first unsettling moments on the water to the final quiet beats that feel less like resolution and more like the opening line of the same story told again. We began by pulling apart the plot, not to spoil it, but to understand how each piece fits into the machinery of its narrative loop. We watched the storm roll in and saw the way the ship rose out of the mist, not just as a plot point, but as the central stage for a deeply symbolic drama. We walked those narrow corridors, noticing how they seemed to fold in on themselves, how each hallway whispered that we had been here before, and we followed the protagonist